Feedback is a challenging but necessary component of education. Whether we are learners or teachers, giving and receiving feedback is a skill that requires practice. This video primer is intended to give you a brief overview of the mechanics and dynamics of giving and receiving feedback more effectively. By the end of this primer, you should be able to summarize challenges with giving and receiving feedback, describe the elements of effective feedback, and recognize strategies you can use to improve the feedback process. Think of a time when someone gave you memorable feedback. Why was it memorable? Did it have anything to do with how the feedback was delivered? Where it was delivered? How did it make you feel? Did you have a chance to respond? We give and receive feedback every day, whether it be related to precepting a learner or daily activities. Imagine you just completed a medication review with a patient and received this feedback. Even though the feedback sounds positive, it's general and vague. More helpful feedback would have identified the behaviors, such as communication skills or medication knowledge, that contributed positively or negatively to the interaction. By identifying the desired behaviors, learners know what specifically is being done well and should be carried forward to future interactions. The context of feedback we are discussing is formative feedback. This is the ongoing supportive conversation between teacher and learner about how they are progressing towards agreed upon learning objectives. It involves identification of learning gaps and strategies to enable further improvement. For example, the discussion that occurs between teacher and learner after the learner counseled a patient. The midpoint APPE assessment is also considered formative feedback. In contrast, summative feedback occurs at the end of a learning unit or APPE rotation and is a final evaluation of how learners have performed during their time with you. The final grade assigned after each APPE rotation is considered summative feedback. Learners often feel the feedback they received was unsatisfactory, not enough feedback, poor quality, not specific or actionable. In contrast, when teachers are asked about feedback, most feel they spend a disproportionately large amount of time doing this. So, it appears there's a mismatch. We believe that we are giving lots of feedback, while learners feel they don't receive enough or the quality is poor. As such, we are going to address two key challenges related to feedback. Giving feedback is hard, and receiving feedback is complex. To address these challenges, let's consider two aspects of feedback: the mechanics or process of giving feedback, and the dynamics or what influences how people respond to feedback. Let's explore the first challenge. Giving feedback is hard. The process used, or how feedback is delivered, is a vital component of guiding learners towards learning outcomes. Feedback should be timely, specific, and actionable. Poorly delivered feedback can have adverse consequences. Learners may inadvertently drop positive behaviors by making wrong assumptions about their progress. It can decrease their self-esteem and damage the teacher's credibility, and overall creates an unpleasant education experience. There are many ways or models for giving feedback. The feedback sandwich is commonly used to deliver feedback: a positive comment followed by negative, ending with positive. It's easy to use, but it is repetitive and predictable, and it's been shown that it doesn't actually change learner performance. While there isn't one universally accepted way to deliver feedback, experts agree it is important to be explicit about when and how you will give feedback. How many times have you heard someone say, "You never gave me any feedback," and yet you think, "That's all I did"? Drawing attention to the fact that you are providing feedback will help prepare learners to listen to your feedback. We are going to describe one model for feedback developed by Brown, Hodges, and Wakefield. We like this model because it breaks the feedback process down into steps. Each step serves a distinct purpose in the feedback cycle. The 6 steps are: observe student behavior, ask for self-assessment, describe or model the desired behavior, understand the gap, make an action plan to close the gap, and follow up on improvement. Let's explore each step in more detail. To be authentic, feedback should be based on what you directly observed or from a trustworthy source. Next, invite the learner to provide a self-assessment on how they did. This encourages the sharing of information and promotes an educational environment where a learner's assessment of their own performance is valued. It's also a good way to prevent yourself as a teacher from giving premature feedback. The risk in providing premature feedback is that it may cause your learner to withhold questions about their own performance because they don't want to appear incompetent. Lastly, it's important to ask for self-assessment at an appropriate place and time. If your student has just finished an emotionally draining or challenging encounter, it may not be the best time to ask for self-assessment. They may need a few minutes to gather their thoughts before being able to comment objectively. Describing the desired behavior allows you to articulate what is expected and compare that to how they did. You may also choose to model the desired behavior and then discuss what was different between what you did and how the student did. Subjective observations should be labeled as such. For example, I thought you were nervous because you were speaking very quietly. You don't know if they were nervous, but you can describe behaviors you saw and what you concluded from them. Avoid sweeping statements or judgments unless you follow them up with concrete descriptive examples. After you have discussed the desired behavior and compared it to the learner's performance, test their understanding of the learning gap by inviting them to summarize or paraphrase your feedback. Coming up with an action plan to close the gap is something that should be negotiated between the teacher and learner. The action plan should align with the identified gap and should take into consideration things like time and workload. For example, if there is a lack of knowledge in a particular area, you could ask what they could do to improve their knowledge. They might suggest doing some reading. You can help point them in the right direction by recommending key readings that would be relevant and current and that can be read in a reasonable time frame. The last step is following up on improvement. This is important to reinforce learning and gives the learners an opportunity to ask questions or gain further clarification about something. Deciding when to follow up is also important. Again, depending on the complexity of the task and opportunities available to practice, you and the learner should negotiate a reasonable time frame to follow up. So, we have described one process for giving feedback, and you may already be doing many of these things. However, have you ever wondered why learners sometimes don't respond to your feedback the way you would expect? One of the frustrations in giving feedback is that learner response is not predictable. Feedback devices like a thermostat provide predictable responses. When a certain temperature is reached, the heat will come on. Now, imagine the fuel gauge on a car. Just because it's pointing on empty doesn't mean the driver will automatically pull into the next gas station. Providing feedback to students can sometimes feel like this. Their response to your feedback can be variable and unpredictable. Educators are rethinking feedback. Traditionally, we have taken a teacher-centric approach to feedback by focusing on the process of giving feedback. However, attention must also be paid to how feedback is received. For example, a lack of confidence or experience with a particular task affects how learners react or respond to feedback. Not wanting to seem unprepared may make someone hesitant to ask for feedback or provide an accurate self-assessment. On the other hand, overconfidence or those with lots of experience may not acknowledge or value the feedback being provided. A learner's emotional state also influences their receptiveness to feedback. A particularly harsh assessment from a previous rotation may make a learner less likely to seek feedback for fear of exposing a weakness or flaw in their performance. In other words, receiving feedback is complex. Ultimately, the receiver is in charge of what they let in and how and whether they choose to change. While process or mechanics of giving feedback is important, We also need to pay attention to the dynamics or what influences how people react or respond to feedback. Here are some ways to improve responsiveness to feedback. Create a safe learning environment that promotes a culture of feedback. Provide regular opportunities for feedback and encourage learners to ask for feedback. Ask learners to give you feedback. Feedback delivered from a credible and beneficent source is more likely to positively influence behavior. This involves developing a trusting relationship. This can be fostered by giving feedback on what you have directly observed and reminding learners that you both share a common goal, which is to complete the rotation successfully. Credibility as a clinician will also influence whether a learner decides to accept your feedback or not. So, if you are not sure about something, say so. Use it as an opportunity to learn together. Learners value teachers that are enthusiastic, supportive, and willing to help. Demonstrating respect, a caring attitude, and positive reinforcement can enhance learner motivation and engagement. Here are some other tips for effective feedback. Make feedback routine and part of the culture. Feedback is a dialogue, not a monologue. Label it. Tell your learners when feedback is about to occur. Base your comments on observed behaviors that the learner can modify. Individualize your comments and give specific examples. Don't overload the student with comments. Prioritize what you feel needs to be discussed now and what can wait until later. A good tip is for you and your student to decide the things that you will be focusing on before an encounter. For example, if your student is about to perform a medication history, you might decide to focus on whether they gathered all the necessary information before the patient leaves. You may decide to talk about nonverbal communication skills afterwards when the patient has left and you have more time to discuss this in detail. Lastly, it does require teachers and learners' tolerance of discomfort and criticism, as not everything will always sound favorable. Providing effective feedback is essential in guiding learners towards achieving desired educational outcomes. Use the learning contract and expected levels of performance documents in the APPE manual to help guide you. Giving feedback is hard. Thinking about the mechanics of giving feedback using a model or framework, such as the 6 steps, can help improve the way you give feedback. Remember to be explicit and let learners know whenever you are giving them feedback. In other words, label it. Receiving feedback is complex. Process is important, but there are other factors that influence how a learner responds to feedback. Dialogue between learner and teacher is essential to be an effective feedback encounter. Consider the elements that work towards creating a positive feedback culture, such as the learning environment and building a trusting relationship between teacher and learner. Lastly, mastering feedback is part of lifelong learning. Get feedback on your feedback from your students, peers, and mentors, so you know what's working and what you can improve for next time. This is the end of our video primer on feedback. We hope you have gained some useful tips. What's one new thing you would like to try during your next feedback encounter?